me see how, there we go. So this presentation is surprisingly whittled down from a ginormous presentation from our French parent company, LAFFORT, in Bordeaux. Dr. Virginie Moin, she did the original, and Sean Richardson, our GM of the US subsidiary, LAFFORT USA, helped whittle it down with me. And just as a little background, LAFFORT USA, we've been around for about 10 years, separate on our own, and LAFFORT in general has been around for 125 years, celebrating this year, back to our founder, Jean LAFFORT, and he was working with Pasteur back in the day, and we have a lot of research background. We focused on that for innovation as well, to really expand knowledge within the wine industry and to become leaders. We have a large lab in Sarco. You'll see a lot of numbers and graphs, and that lab in Bordeaux called Sarco is where we get all of that information. It's one of the largest wine labs in the world, and we have a lot of pride there. We have a lot of employees, very dedicated, who are constantly researching and analyzing everything that we produce. So without further ado, let's jump on in. Okay, so here's the general format of what we'll be going over. It is long. It'll be about 90 slides. I'll go as quickly as I can. So we'll go through the overview, and then we'll hit each major stabilization, microbial, protein, color, tartrate, and then we'll also talk about filtration, filterability, and briefly about bottling timelines, which is important in all of this. Overall, give yourself 4 to 6 weeks. That's a big takeaway. All right, let's zoom through. Okay, so clarity and stability. Famous quote here out of Riviere-Guillon's Handbook of Enology, his iconic text about quality as it relates to clarity and stability. So clarity is making sure your wine looks clean, in essence, and doesn't have anything floating around in it to discourage consumer purchasing. And then stability is the long-term clarity, as we'll go over. To kind of back that up, we've done some studies. We hired a consultant, Montpaul, to do a consumer study. We compared U.S. and Chinese consumers at the time, as the Chinese market was blowing up, and we found that a lot of consumers have seen wines previously or seen wines with sediments previously, and that half of them were okay in China. Only 33% had seen it in the U.S., and that number will continue to decrease as more and more improve stability and stabilization. The key thing to take out was at the very bottom of this slide here. Only 16% of American and only 32% of Chinese consumers would buy a wine with sediment in it, including red. So if they see it on the shelf, or they're examining the bottle and they see that, there's a high chance that they will not buy that, which is not good for you. So here we'll go over more of that. Okay, so to reach clarity and stability, you reach clarity through clarification means, whether that's fining or filtration, enzyme use, combinations thereof. And then stability is through efficient treatments. So, and you must understand both how to implement those treatments when they're appropriate, and then also how to make sure that you understand what the consequences can be, both organoleptic, quality, stability, clogging potential for filters, and time, simply time. Some methods are good for a few years. Some methods are good for longer than that. Okay, so an example there that I like to point out on those examples are the first and the last ones. The filtration, you can clarify. So you might get out a lot of floating particulate matter, your NTUs will go down, but it doesn't actually stabilize your wine, meaning you could form a haze later. You could throw sediment or precipitates later. And then the last one there that says certain colloid additions improve and prolong the stability equilibrium. That's very true, but not necessarily do they clarify the wine. So those are two opposite sides of this same coin of stabilization. So we have different products and different processes that that are very specific in what they do, and rarely do they do both. So make sure you keep these two concepts in mind. So there we go, a little review, and this is clarification versus stabilization. Okay, so let's get into stabilization. Here's our roadmap that we like to present. Again, I mentioned the 4 to 6 weeks earlier, and that is at the top. That's the timeline. So it starts there, goes left to right. The F's with the triangles are filtration steps. The first one is your kind of polish or cellar filtration, your rougher filtration, and then the second F is typically your final filtration, your sterile filtration. Then below that, you see 3 of the major stabilizations, microbial, protein, and color, are before your cellar filtration. You want to make sure those are all in line, and then depending on your timelines, you can do tartaric typically after that. At the bottom are general guidelines for products and when to add them on that timeline. They do vary. It can be very wine specific or even just time specific, depending on how much time. But this is our official roadmap. We'll start going into these here. If I can get this to change. For each stabilization, you want to ask yourself these questions, and we're going to try to go over all of these for each stabilization. Some of them we may kind of go more quickly just in the interest of time, but this right here is a very important slide. I recommend printing this one out, and until you get, if you're not as familiar with a stabilization technique, just always ask yourself these questions along the way, and you should be able to keep yourself safe and your wine quality high with minimal consequences. If you do ever have any questions, you can email any of our reps, myself for Napa or the East Coast. We have a whole list of other reps all around California, West Coast, and Midwest, the South on our website. Okay, let's dive into the first stabilization, which is microbiological. So the risks here are biohazes. You can have yeast re-fermenting. That's not fun if someone opens a bottle and it spouts everywhere in their face, on the shirt, and you didn't mean that to happen if it's not a sparkling wine. You can have Brettanomyces, the big bad Brett, just that terrible barnyard or medicinal smell. If it's too much, of course there's always the artistic use of it in wines, which I personally like a little touch of it sometimes here or there, but too much can be too much, or if you don't want it at all, and you even have a touch of it, it's very marked. Acetobacter, lactobacillus, both obviously terrible for your wines if not intended, and any type of wine can be affected by this. So very, very important. This is the first step you want to take. And you can throw hazes that are at risk or already contaminated, even if you don't know it, either by your SO2 levels in bottling too low, too much heat, you have a bad cork, insufficient closures, or your RS is still high and you didn't take proper procedure to mitigate or eliminate any, say, yeast from re-fermenting that residual sugar. Okay, so that first question, is my wine stable from a microbiological standpoint? So you want to do a microbiological assessment. You can do that either by scorpion, concentrated scorpion tests at labs that have equipment to do that. Basically, they take your wine, analyze it for RNA specific to certain bacteria, yeast, uh, microbes, and then they tell you what they found and estimate through that populations. The only thing about that, the downside is that the accuracy or the threshold is not, it doesn't go down as low as possible for figuring out cell counts. There is a bit of margin of error there, and it's hard to get below 10 cells per mil. Plate cell count is the best way. It takes longer. It does take a few weeks, but your results are generally more accurate and also will give you a direct result as to viable organisms. Sometimes you might get a scorpion back that says, oh yeah, there's this and this and this, but it might not actually be viable. All right, let's see. Oh, scorpion limit actually 5 CFU now, which is good as they keep getting per mil, as they keep getting more accurate. And actually, I've heard that it goes down to about 2, maybe even 1 now, with what's called a concentrated scorpion. So check those out. Okay, here are your options. The physical treatments are, well, I'm not even going to give time to flash pasteurization because that one's just so destructive on aromatics. Very few people do that anymore. If you are, just be aware you might want to switch to other ways such as filtration, which is the sterile filtration, and cross-flow pad, other types of cellular filtration treatments, because you can essentially do some of the same things without horrendously destroying your wine. And then there are also ingredients to reduce that microbial load, such as SO2, which everyone knows. Enzymes can help break down certain microbes. Fining, these are all non-selective. They just kind of go and destroy everything. And then you also have selective treatments like lysozyme for lactobacillus, sorbate for yeast, and then enobred, which we'll talk about later for Brettanomyces, which is one of our products, chitosan based. Thing to take into consideration again, different treatments result in different results. Remember, think of the consequences of each treatment. That's one of the recommendations. So you have your control here on the left side. Very quickly, crossflow, great for pulling things out of your wine, increasing clarity, reducing microbial load in general. Even though it's not sterile, typically it is very good at that. However, you can increase your instability of coloring matter in a wine. Whereas if you use something like enobred, you'll lower your coloring instability. That's just something to consider. I'm not saying one's better than the other, but just keep that in mind. And also, again, flash pasteurization. Basically, look at that, it destroys aromatics. So don't do it. Okay. Checking the efficacy of treatment for microbial load. For example, you take regular gelatin. On the left, the wine has been racked, but it's unfined, nothing used. Brett everywhere, nasty. In the middle, you have a low dose of gelatin used. Wow, that's a significant drop. You can just see it there in that middle plate, and it has dropped considerably. You do a double dose, and you've already reduced your microbial load down to 1.1 to the second CFUs per mil. So right then and there, just even with old school fining, you can reduce those populations. Won't eliminate it, but we'll reduce it. So what's the next step? Let's try enzymes. So you can add a pectinase with beta-glucanase, our extralyzed product, and just again, left to right, you can see the drop on 4EP and 4EG at the end of aging. So unracked, uncontrolled, or control wine didn't do anything. You have right there at the threshold, which is around 700. So people are going to start picking that up at 660. If you have racked wine, you're down to 290, much lower. And then if you use the extra lice, you can see you knock it down to 120, which is well below threshold. And again, at the bottom, a little filtering bonus. So another consequence, they're not always negative, they can be positive. So the extra lice will have a positive bonus or consequence of better filtration down the line because of those pectinases and glucanases. So enobret, we have our chitosan and beta glucanase. So we're like, okay, well, we've got chitosan, which is already great at knocking down Brett. We know extra lice does that as well to some extent with the previous slide. So let's combine them. And that's what we did. Enobret is chitosan and beta glucanase mixed together. And it does a great job. As you can see here, the control wine was contaminated and the population dipped a little, but then went right back up. With enobret, it went down within 3 weeks there. I mean, 2 weeks, 2.5 weeks, down to unmeasurable. So it's a great product, and we'll go over that. Chitosan from chitin, Aspergillus niger, derived. It's always in the wine industry, it has to be from fungus. Don't ever get it if someone offers you chitosan derived from shellfish. That's illegal in the wine industry. And as a bonus, it's considered non-allergenic, and it's considered vegan as well, since it's from Aspergillus niger. So chitosan, this large polysaccharide, and it is a linear polysaccharide, and it will show. Well, we'll kind of get into how it works, but the most important thing to take away is that it's plentiful. There's tons of it produced naturally, and we've isolated it, and we can use it for which is, here's Brettanomyces right in the middle there. Not your friend. You can see a cell wall, you can see the cell membrane, and you can see organelles visible. So that's a happy Brettanomyces, which means we are unhappy as winemakers. So what do we want to do? We want this to happen. We want the skeleton to show up. That's chitosan surrounding it, that kind of middle gray matter. And then at the very bottom, you can see pure and utter destruction. And that's just beautiful, like bye-bye Brettanomyces. So the enzymes combined with the chitosan pierce the cell walls, pierce the membrane, get into the organelles, and wreak havoc. So rendering your Brettanomyces population not only dead, but also non-viable. This is a table, a lot of numbers. I'm just going to point out right here. Hopefully you can see my mouse. Right here, if you don't treat your wine, this is the 4EP, 4EG measurement, and it is very high. Remember, average threshold is around 700, so we're well above it. And then up here, this is uncontaminated wine that's been treated with both racked and unracked. I'll talk a little bit about that. In essence, if it's uncontaminated wine, you have nice low numbers. Over here, you've sterile filtered. Now, we've touched on it before, but sterile filtration has other unintended consequences, which one can be a microbial desert. So think of it this way: you sterile filter, and you've eliminated everything you've filtered out every microbe from your wine. But now you have a bunch of substrate, a bunch of nutrients in there, and nothing's there. Well, what's going to happen? It's going to get invaded ASAP by the first contamination, and if it's Brett, it's going to spread very quickly in that environment. So be careful of that microbial desert and sterile filtering too early. This right here shows that enobret, a contaminated wine with enobret in it that was unracked, maintains low levels, below threshold typically. And I think the highest number here was 536 that we found, and that was at contamination. So it was high, and then immediately got knocked down to lower numbers 1 month and 2 months after contamination. And the reason I said just be careful, or there's a difference between racked and unracked. We found that unracked, leaving your wine on the enobret will help maintain that kill level against Brettanomyces, not just killing the initial population you might have, but also decreasing or preventing a recontamination. And it's simple. It's the beta glucanase and the chitosan are still in your wine, and even though they're at the bottom, maybe settled down, they're still there and they're still affecting any potential recontamination. All right, so on to protein stabilization. So that's microbial. I know that was fast, but basically get tested, get your wine tested, get it plated, choose the right method for you, and understand those consequences, whether they're positive or negative. And once you've done that, once you've created a good protocol for yourself and for your wine, now tackle protein stabilization. All right, protein hazes under heat, transportation in a truck, a hot truck, storage in a warm warehouse. Proteins can denature, flocculate, and create a haze. This can affect all wines. It happens in reds, although a lot of the times it goes unnoticed, but you can see it in certain reds. And then like lighter reds, ones without many tannins to help prevent the protein haze. But mostly we're talking about whites and rosés here. Want those flakes or those hazes floating around, those globules that you can see if you've ever seen a protein unstable. Looks pretty, I was telling my wife, I described it as boogers. It looks like boogers to me. So, and not enough, that description was enough for her to be like, oh yeah, no, I wouldn't want to drink that. So anyways, these hazes can occur if you have inefficient fining, you puncture a filter, or you clog a filter during bottling. Let me quickly talk about that. So that's right. Here's my mouse. There we go. Right there. That part. This will come up multiple times. I'll go over it right now, just in depth a little bit. The concept of clogging filtration. And at first you think, oh, you've clogged it, so maybe you blow something, you blow a filter, and that, of course, now lets in everything. So yeah, that can happen. But the other thing that can happen, almost more importantly to be aware of, is if you clog a filter to the point where it's retaining a lot of pressure, but it's still letting your wine through, the filter can start to retain protective colloids. Now, these are colloids that are actually helping you maintain stability or preventing interactions within your wine. And if you get to a certain point, a certain pressure in filtering, and it's pretty high, but you'll notice it, you'll see spikes. If you ever see those spikes, do a reassessment of your filters, make sure everything's good, and that you get your flow, your pressure back to normal spec, because if you pull those out, you won't see it right away, but your wine is now unstable again. So it's good to monitor your filtration pressures, and talk to your filtration specialist if you have one. If you can talk to one, if they come by with their truck or whatever, or drop off equipment for you, or just your cellar master or yourself, become more familiar with that, because spikes in pressure can indicate, or you might find that you're stripping those colloids, and that can lead to a cascade effect down the line of instability. Okay, so I've talked about that. Lysozyme, it's a protein, it's an enzyme, and it's highly unstable, heat unstable. Core quality, that's another one, in wine storage, like we said. So always check those whenever possible. Okay, so let's review some of the protein tests. Most are based on flocculation of proteins, and then there's a protein. There's like an immunological test. There's a tannin test, chemical reagent test. I'm only going to go over two, because the tannin test, don't ever do it. It's wildly not only inaccurate, really, but just not realistic compared to what we do in winemaking and what your wine will actually be doing. if it encounters heat conditions. So of course, heat test is the best. This is short time, 30 minutes, high heat, 80 degrees centigrade. And then after that 30 minutes, you bring it out and you let it sit in room temperature for 45 minutes. And then you look and you check. You check for the NTUs. You can do a visual check because if anything's going to flocculate and be visual at that point, obviously your NTUs are way off the chart. Excuse me. Chemical test, don't do this one either because just really quickly, you can see at the bottom, the change in NTU using a chemical test can be way different from the heat test, at which point, caution, your bentonite dosage will then correspondingly be way off. So on the right side there, you can see that the bentonite dosage suggested by the chemical test, the bento test, is almost 400 grams per hectoliter. No, thank you. The heat test, on the other hand, gave a much more realistic, about 50, 40, 45 grams per hectoliter. So it's a more accurate test, and it is more, it corresponds basically with what your wine might actually encounter. Although I hope it never encounters 80 degrees Celsius ever. Okay. Here's our protocol. I won't go over it all, but take a snapshot right now of it with your phone if you'd like. If you want to have quick access to it right now, we can also send you this if you send us an email or request it. The basics of it are measure your turbidity first. If you're greater than 2 NTU, filter the wine so it's below 2 NTU. Heat your sample at those parameters, let it cool for the 45 minutes, and then measure your turbidity again. If your change in NTU is more than 2, you're unstable. 2 and less, you're stable in terms of protein and heat. Okay, don't do anything like artificially shortening your cooling time or letting the cooling time go for too long, because as you can see, you can either under or overestimate bentonite. These are some of my favorite photos. This is where one of our reps went to an unnamed winery, and the winemaker was using a coffee pot to use as a hot water bath. Cool, probably works, probably way too hot, I'm thinking, if it keeps coffee closer to like 95 degrees centigrade. So you might be over bentoniting, but ingenious, but not as accurate. We do recommend using a qualified lab for it, or using in your own lab, using very standardized and very controlled environments. Their test was the back of my car test. Just drive it around for a weekend, leave the wine in the trunk of my car, and we'll check it later. And does it have protein floating around? So in terms of treatment, we've got bentonite, which is still pretty much the only way to treat your heat or protein stabilize your wine to this day. We've got different types. We'll kind of go into a little bit, but basically calcium, fast, very good settling, very dense, condensed and flattened settling. You have less loss. Sodium bentonite expands more in water. When you do the swelling, it absorbs more proteins in general, and it leaves a little fluffier amounts of lees at the bottom. But the trade-off is higher quality bentonite. So they are, well, and we'll also go into the fact that sodium bentonites typically can also withstand higher pHs, which is important, as we'll go in. Okay, so when do I use them? What are the different characteristics here? Sodium versus calcium. Aromatic preservation on the far right there. Yeah. Pluses are good, obviously, but so I have found that the sodium bentonite, our microcal alpha, is actually very good at preserving aromatics with minimal. So you get really good protein stabilization while minimizing your aromatic loss. Not all bentonites are created equal, and we source extremely high quality bentonite to ensure that the aromatic loss is minimal. There are cheaper, there are quicker bentonites out there, but it comes at a price, and that is the quality of your wine. Okay, so your options here, bentonite wine, we're just looking at here. Basically, you just need to figure out what's the best dose, the minimum best dose to make sure that your stabilization is done, but also minimizing aromatic loss. And again, not all bentonites are created equal. You can see with this specific molecule 3MH that this thiol is gone. With bentonite Z, a lot lower. I mean, that looks like over 20% loss of aromatics versus bentonite Y, which was below 5% there. Why? Probably microbiological alpha. Let's see. So how do I choose the appropriate treatment? You've done the heat test, and now you're going to do a trial. So the difference between what some people call a heat check and a heat trial, the trial is where you're going to do a range of different doses on samples of your wine, bentonite doses, to determine which one gets you to below that 2. That change in NTU turbidity. So do at least 2 to 3 doses. Some people use 5, some people 10, whatever you're comfortable with, whatever your time frame. You add your bentonite, you check it 30 minutes later, you draw from the top, and you measure those NTUs. And basically, you'll see, oh, 1 pound per thousand. I had a change of 10. Not good enough. 1.25. Now I'm down to 5 NTU change. And then maybe somewhere around 1.5, 1.75, 2, whatever it may be, you'll see it goes to below 2. And that's where you're going to want to start saying, okay, I'm going to consider these, I'm going to taste them, smell them. Which one do I think I can get away with without losing too many aromatics or flavors? And that's your dose. The heat check, sometimes people get confused, but the heat check is simply that. It's a one-time check of one sample. What is the change in NTU on that one? And so that's usually a pass-fail for wines. You say, oh, run a heat check on that wine. It doesn't mean do the trials all over again. It just means on this wine, this sample, check the heat stability. And then you get a quick assessment if a treatment was effective. Okay, important note right there towards the bottom. Prepare the bentonite in the lab the same exact way and using the same exact bentonite that you'll use in the cellar. Might seem obvious, but we've seen this many times where a different bentonite is used, and different bentonites, again, have different capacities, different rates of effectiveness, and one rate may be different from the other, and you'll go to use yours and you'll use the rate that was determined in the lab, but your heat check at the end will fail. So make sure that they are the same. Okay, again, use the same bentonite. We like to hammer that home. In the cellar, do a 5% solution. Keep stirring for a long time. This is for microbiological, by the way. You want to let that swell for 12 to 24 hours and keep stirring for those 2 hours first. Let it sit and then stir again before putting it in. So make sure you stir again before putting it in. And then you go in with a venturi or over the top as you're rolling with nitrogen or mixing with a pump. And then if you want it to go faster, you can add Silagel and Gelarom or Gcol Supra gelatin a day later. And then after you've added it, you let it settle for a while, a week, 2 weeks, whatever you're comfortable with. And then you check your efficacy. Interesting thing about protein stabilization, the higher the pH, the more bentonite you need. So at a certain pH, though, it's crazy, pH 4, which is very close to what a lot of wines are these days. You can't add enough bentonite to stabilize. Some, yes. We'll go into this. I'll show you these charts here. So this is a colorful graph, line graph, and basically all of the very colorful ones grouped together at the bottom, all of those wines are 3.8 pH or below. The one at the top with the circles, starting at 90 and going down, that's a pH 4 wine. It never, even up to 100 grams per hectoliter as a dose along the bottom there, the x-axis, you never hit that stability threshold. That dashed line is 2 NTU, and you never hit it, even with a huge amount of bentonite. So the takeaway from this is either use a bentonite that can handle pH 4 or maybe a little higher, which is microbiological alpha, spoiler alert, or acidify your wine a bit and help yourself. Stylistically, I think now wines are coming back down in pH, thankfully. So this is becoming less and less of an issue. But if you ever do run across this, just know that at a certain point, you can't dump enough bentonite in there to stay. So yeah, here we go. Here's this. I spoiled this, but microbiological alpha up top in the middle at pH 3.4 stabilizes at 40 grams per hectoliter. On the bottom in the middle, if you look right here, still stabilizes at 60. Cl, which is a calcium bentonite that we actually don't sell here in the US except by special order, but we have Ft, which is another calcium bentonite that we have. They don't stabilize at 4.0 effectively, like within reason. I mean, maybe if you go up to like 500, I don't know, but just don't use the calcium bentonite. They don't work well at the higher pHs if you're close to 4. Okay, so parameters influencing stability. This is these are things like skin contact, extended skin contact, which kind of is ebbed and flow and peaked in popularity with white varietals. Maybe you have a lot of slip skin varietals where you have a lot of proteins coming out of there. You can also, if you add too much SO2 to the grapes as they come in, you can melt a lot of those skins, and it's an organic solvent, so you start to degrade the grapes, and you're extracting a lot more protein there. And then pressed juice is more unstable than free run juice, and that's probably pretty obvious because as you press, you're breaking up more of the pulp, and you're really squeezing out from that where a lot of those proteins are holding on to and coming out of. So anyways, another thing here, lees aging. If you ever do lees aging, that actually helps you. So you can see there, even though those are all fails, the wine aged 10 months on lees failed way less dramatically than a wine, the same wine post fermentation. So, and you can see it's kind of semi-linear maybe, aged 4 months versus 10 months. So you can see the progression down, or maybe for you guys down that way. Let's see, parameters influencing stability. So lysozyme also, here's another thing, and you can see obviously control was okay, you're close. Bentonite required to stabilize that, only 400 ppm or milligrams per, liter. With lysozyme, that control shot up to 57 NTU change. Now requires 1,200, so 3 times more bentonite to stabilize. This is, don't use lysozyme if you want heat stability, unless you're absolutely sure you need to use it. Try to avoid the problem in the first place. Maybe address protocols, microbial stability further upstream, or in the case of grapes coming in that are already highly infected, throw the lysozyme in before fermentation or during fermentation, the early steps, and fermentation will help degrade the lysozyme. Okay, so here are more parameters. There's the grape varietal, all that stuff. There's so many parameters on that. I'm not even going to go into it, but just every wine is unique. Every lot is unique. So as you as a winemaker, get to know your wines and your lots more, you'll understand, hey, yeah, this works, this doesn't. This one's super unstable all the time. I'm going to hit it early with bentonite in the must, that versus hitting it with bentonite in the wine stage because it makes it easier. Again, clogging filtration can make wine unstable. I already went over that, but that's basically showing some results where before bottling, stable, 0.5 change in NTU. Yay! But then at the end of bottling, because you clogged a filter, strip those protective colloids, now the wine is technically F4. How do I carry out the treatment in the cellar? For protein stabilization, what's great is that you can get ahead of the game. You don't always have to just rely on bentonite on your wine, a month before bottling. You can get way ahead of this. And how do you do that? You do it on the must. So you can do it for early release wines. You can do it for just wines in general that just give you problems down the line, infiltration issues, things like that. This is a great way to do it. Botrytis affected fruit, as it's noted there. You can use it says calcium here, but you can also use sodium bentonite. And you hydrate it, you let it swell, and then you put it into your must. You mix it in, and you can mix it in during fermentation as well, just before fermentation. And then after fermentation, you'll notice it settles very quickly, and you just rack it right away. It says no lees aging possible, but for those of you familiar with products like our Eno-Lees, you can still add back lees later in that way, or you can add it from somewhere else in your cellar. So, but of course, that you have this risk of, if it's from somewhere else in your cellar, you risk reintroducing a bunch of unstable proteins, unless that was from a more stable lot. But everything. Remember, always just think, what are my options and what are the consequences? Okay, on wine, again, we've already gone over that, so you can use bentonite on wine. Okay, alpha is the sodium bentonite that I was talking about. That can also go down to potentially up to 4.0 pH and still stabilize. Microcal FT is our calcium bentonite, very fast, really good for juice and also cross-flow filtration. It doesn't have the silica content, which is terrible for cross-flow and filters. That can scour, but FT doesn't. Effect on compounds, yay! Our microcols do great, and bentonite Z again, just lagging. Okay, color stabilization. So this is an important stabilization that gets overlooked a lot of the times. It's popping up more and more on people's radar, though, because it goes hand in hand with growing tartrate instability, tartrate crystals. And well, let me just jump into it and you'll see why. Basically, you don't want to throw color crystals, and you'll throw color crystals in conjunction with tartaric acid in certain conditions. And it's very important to do this color stabilization, especially if you're going to use something like a CMC, like our cell stab, or manostab, which is our manoprotein stabilization product. It can also become important in like age-worthy reds. That's when you pull the cork out and you see a bunch of red crystals on the cork. So that's color instability. And you might not have seen it after 4 years, 5 years, maybe 7 years, 10 years down the line. At some point, it might throw. Get into this. It's basically similar to tartaric instability. You'll throw these red colored crystals, and it's actually the coloring matter. So it's your phenolic coloring matter, and it's attaching basically to the tartaric crystals as they form, because they're both unstable at that time. So again, filtration, you can throw this later if you've taken out the protective colloids, and then exposure to cold will do this. do you test for color stability? I just threw this up here. We put this in here because it shows this was unscientific. It was just a questionnaire that we had at the end of one of our large rendezvous wine education events, and not surprisingly, only 8 out of, what is that, 54? Yay, my math. Is only 8 out of 54 people said yes. So we're trying to get that on people's radar. So here's the cold test for determining your coloring matter stability. This is a test that we do here at our Napa store for people if they want color stability. So you filter the wine first through a 0.65 micrometer membrane and the pre-filter. You check the NTUs on that before you put it in the refrigerator. Record that NTU, throw it into your refrigerator for 2 days, take it back out, let it warm up for 15 minutes at room temp, and that's very, very important. The reason why is if you don't want condensation forming on the outside of your NTU vial, because that will throw off the measurement. Okay, so the difference in NTU is your change in NTU, and if that is above 2, then you are unstable. I'm sorry, above 5, you're unstable. So anything below 5, you're stable. Anything above that, you have the range from slightly unstable to very unstable or strong instability. In here, pluses are a negative. Again, taken from France, but here you don't want those pluses. Maybe I'll just delete those someday and just say strong instability. So the reason that we have been focusing more on this is that back in 2009, we started checking, well, we've always recorded coloring instability in wines, especially our parent company LAFFORT in France at their Sarco lab. So they get samples coming in from all, and they started to notice this trend. And you can see that the overall trend is that the coloring matter instability have been not only getting higher and more dramatic, but overall more of them have been coming up into that unstable area above that line. So here, much lower, 2012, especially 2011, but 2012 still very high. A little older info. We'll get some more info, hopefully some updates in the coming year or two, but shows the trend and why we were concerned about this. So here's why. More extraction, higher extraction techniques, more protein coming out, less fining usage to preserve organoleptics, and thermovinification, which I already said. So what did we do to address this? There's 2 things. We wanted to identify what is this coloring matter exactly. So that's Project MatCol. And then there's what can we do to stabilize coloring matter in terms of gum arabic? Because we know that that's a known stabilizer, and there are a lot of different fractions. So gum arabic is taken from an acacia tree, and there are so many compounds in there, dozens, probably hundreds, I would say. And we can isolate them and figure out exactly which fractions are the best at stabilizing in each way. So those are the 2 projects. So there we go. There we go. Kind of what I said. Okay, so coloring matter stabilization dates back to 1979. There's a bunch done. They were like, oh man, these are phenolic compounds. They don't really cells, but they are sensitive to colloidal interactions, which then lets them be taken out by acid. And it happens when it's so okay. So then 79 and nothing for decades. Started our project MatCol. At that point in 2016, we had identified 81% of the precipitate. That was mostly, I think, 51% polyphenols, and then the rest were an assortment of proteins and things like that. It does. We were like, are there differences between different varietals and, and aging even? And we found that not really. So Merlot and Cab here very quickly, very similar lines, both 4 months and 1 month below, and then CD are 4 months later for both Merlot and Cab, and not very different. You can see some differences, but overall very similar in terms of chemical analysis and quantities as well. So it's the same families, about the same amounts, and then the takeaway is barrel aging doesn't really change much of this. So especially the color matter precipitate. So the barrel aging process isn't long enough. Basically, this stuff will change eventually, but that's in bottle where you don't want that to happen, where you don't want to see 10 years later a bunch of red crystals being. Okay. Acacia Senegal, Acacia Sayal. I like to think of Sayal, a softer word. So that's like the softer gum Arabic, and that's what goes into our Stabivin SP. Acacia Senegal, it's a little harder of a word, but that's more for stabilization. Senegal goes into our Stabivin. Does improve mouthfeel as well as a side benefit, but the Stabivin SP is where you want to go if you're really focused on mouthfeel, and it still does stabilize, which is great. So because basically the takeaway, we are studying gum Arabic intensely right now. We do have a new product. I don't think I can mention it yet, but we will be rolling it out soon, so keep an eye out for it. But I will give a little hint that it is for red wines. It's for stabilizing red wines, and it's pretty awesome. So once we get more details about it and we roll it out, you'll hear all about it. But it's very exciting. It's coming down the pipeline. Here we go. So gum Arabic in terms of treatment, stabilizing, and like I said, though, sometimes there's a consequence or an effect, or just understand the timeline of stabilities. So with gum Arabic, after about 7 years, its effectiveness fades. It depends on the wine and the specifics, but generally 5, 7, 10 years if you're lucky, the coloring stability by gum Arabic will degrade. So we're trying to figure out better gum Arabics basically to either handle that or different protocols and different ways. So you can also you can do the cold treatment to precipitate out these coloring matter instability, unstable particles. However, we found that nanoproteins are one of the better ones actually. So they stabilize. They can stabilize coloring matter actively. Certain fractions that we've discovered. So here you can see a red wine, Sentna Steph 2007, and this one, where's my mouse? There we go. This one on the far left is treated, and so is this one, second from the right. The one in the middle on the left, the second from the left, is untreated, and so is the one on the far right. So just remember that. Untreated, you will throw color. And we'll get into what we did here and why these were different a little later. Just a little background, all of our gum Arabic products tested for stability, and you test for stability in a alcoholic mineral matrix, basically a low pH, kind of mimicking a low pH wine, and a mineral fraction with this coloring matter, the blue, suspended in the solution. And you go for 24 hours at 25 Celsius in obscurity, in the darkness. And after that amount of time, if the blue goes to the bottom, that's color unstable, and the gum Arabic is not effective. However, if the blue remains in suspension, that means the coloring matter remained stable, and the gum Arabic was effective. So all of our gum Arabic products go through this and must pass this test. So we did the same test with manoprotein. And we found that not all manoproteins also are equal. So A, B, and C here, left to right. The scale below is 9, or 1 through 10, 9 and 10 being the strongest. And manoprotein A, you can see at any dose remains stable. Manoprotein B failed at the lower doses, and manoprotein C failed. So 9 is equivalent to our Senegal gum, and that would be like Stabivin. And little hint, manoprotein is one of our products called Manostab. So we'll get into this a little later. Tartaric stabilization, piggybacking off of coloring matter stabilization. This is obviously one of the bigger stabilizations, and we'll cover this in about 20 slides here, which hopefully I've got about 10 more minutes, so I'll go quickly on these. Since we've already gone over a lot of these, and most of us are pretty familiar with it, let's just dive in. So here's tartaric acid, great. Okay, so go to here. Just want to point out, you notice at pH 3.6, that's where your KHT, your potassium bitartrate curve flips and starts going back down. So what this means is that your pH, when your supersaturated concentration of tartaric acid in your wine precipitates out, if you're doing like if you're using the cold method, meaning dropping the temperature on your tanks to precipitate it out, you'll go down in pH if you're below 3.6, but if you're above 3.6, you'll actually go up. So keep that in mind. So here's the supersaturation curve on the far right. This is stable. So at any given temperature here with a given concentration of KHT, this is the curve. As you go through this metastable area, you become increasingly unstable to the right. And this dashed line is your supersaturation curve. Anything in here will throw tartrates given that temperature. So right here at 1, this vertical line, that's where as you start moving left, that's where you'll start to throw tartrates from wherever your wine is down to probably about the supersaturation curve, or even all the way potentially down to the saturation curve. So how do you prevent that? And that's what you see as crystals. When you drop the temperature of your tanks, a bottle that isn't cold stable and it's been in a refrigerator for a week, someone throws it in like, yay, I'm gonna have a party. Uh-oh, where are all these crystals? That's what that is. So we have two methods. We have subtractive methods, which is the cold treatment. These are taking the actual tartaric acid out. And reducing that the amount of supersaturation down to a point that's stable, so it won't come out with colder temperatures. There's also electrodialysis. Takes a lot less time, very expensive. You're changing the charges of the ions and of the molecules to prevent that formation. The best way, in my mind, one of the better ways is inhibition, and this is through like CMC or cell stab or through manoproteins. And this prevents crystal nucleation. It interrupts that process so that the crystals can't form their highly intricate matrix. So if you can disrupt that, you will not have those crystals. Okay, so crystallization tests. Here's how to test for stabilization of tartrates. The crystallization test is great because it's a real life test. There's the protocol right there. You can get a copy of it later or take a photo right now. And this is great for both tartaric acid and coloring matter because it does both, and it will show you both in at once and pretty quickly. It takes 6 days. I say pretty quickly though because that's not much time to use if you have enough time to say do a full cold stabilization in cellar. Anyways, so you look for these crystals. If it throws crystals, then you're not stable. There's also the DIT test that some of you who have used our cell stab or manostab checklist are familiar with. It's a way of measuring the degree of tartaric instability. You want 25% or less for use of CellStab. And you want this test to show 20% or less for manoprotein use. This is a very specialized machine. It does not correspond with check lab. It doesn't, or the check stab. It also doesn't correspond that well with the Davis test. So a lot of people think that you can use them interchangeably, but we don't recommend it. It's not part of our official protocol. These are much more stringent tests, much more controlled and measured. Okay, so the Stab Lab, you do this. It basically here, you can't validate the treatment, just making sure that the wine is a wine that can accept the treatment. Big difference. So use DIT first, and then afterwards added your product, and now you want to check to make sure that it's effective. You want to check the efficacy. So use the ISTC 50, also by Stab Lab. The different test. It's seeded with harder. They measure for 4 hours, and basically you want to see a change of 3 or less microsiemens in electroconductivity with either CMC, you can see at the bottom, CMC treated or manostab treated wine, and that's great. The thing to keep in mind is if you're doing a red wine or even a heavily colored rosé that's color unstable, you need to make sure that those wines are color stable first before you run this, because that color stabilization will or instability will not. You might pass here, but you won't pass in real life. So that's why with color, when it comes to color, do your color stabilities first, and then do this, and then I would suggest do a freeze test, throw it in the or the cold test, throw it in your refrigerator. So this is just going over the capabilities, CellStab versus manostab. Up there, the green, less than 25 again, less than 20 DIT percentage. I'm going over this quickly. So again, if you have any questions about these tests, I'm more than happy to answer questions about them. Throw it in the questions and comments or send me an email. For CellStab is easy. It's basically 1 mil per liter. It says right here 10 grams per liter, but it's 1 mil per liter. That's easy. Manostab varies depending on your DIT. White wines and light rosés can use. Don't use it for darker or basically any color unstable wine. So that's darker rosés that aren't color stabilized and red wines. You can use manostab on those. Another advantage to manostab is that your wine doesn't have to be heat stable. You can use manostab on a heat unstable wine as well within certain parameters, but that's on our checklist, which we can send you as well. Crystallization test is really the takeaway from here, but this is a good way. Graph shows if you use CellStab, do this. You can do the ISTC 50 on white wines for both. It's easy. Ignore that check stab for now because we're still on that, but it's not. It overestimates dosing, so just ignore it for now. Crystallization test for again unstable rosé with or potentially unstable rosés with CellStab, and manostab on red wines. CellStab not on reds. If you have the advantage of cold weather, you can naturally stabilize your wines over time. So this is what usually happened with winemakers before modern techniques. This just shows that you can reduce your DIT from 25% at the beginning in December of year 1 or year 0, and then through year 3 by June, or actually by March, you have a DIT of 5 or less, and so you're actually naturally stable. Here's the stability showing instability when filtered through these filters. Basically, if you have a highly unstable coloring mattered wine, red wine, don't use manostab. But if you stable red, then you can, and that's shown right here. So And even though the DIT was under 20, so okay for ManoStab, because it wasn't color stable, it did not stabilize right here. But then here, we brought the DIT down through the use of microcol, and then we could use a dose of ManoStab. Not all CMCs are the same. So that far left, that shows that it's almost 100% CMC in our CellStab. The others are competitors, starting from column D over. And that's just other filler ingredients, basically, or gum arabic, which is basically a filler. It can help. It's like a combo product, but it's best to implement them separately. Here's our protocol. We're not going to spend too much time here. Get the protocol from us. We have our CellStab checklist and go through it. Make sure that your protein's stable, of course. And at the end, sometimes you might see a little rise in your heat instability again, or your heat stability. We're checking into that right now, actually, with some clients. But we haven't shown that even if you hit 2 or slightly above 2 NTU on your post CellStab heat check, that it's heat unstable. But we're looking to document this and get official word out so that you don't have to worry. But we've seen that it doesn't affect it. It cold stabilizes and does not throw off your heat instability. Tannins, quick note here, you could have a stable wine and you haven't added anything. You add the CMC. The red triangles show heat instability threshold, and the blue squares show your cold stability. So, okay, and that dashed dot line at 2 is unstable for both. So 2 for protein on the far left, on the far right, you're seeing 3 for tartaric stability. So the blue is on the right. Anyways, they lined up the stability at the same level, basically, for this graph. Here, no tannins added, stable, great. Now, we're heat unstable because we have a tannin and we're cold unstable. And if we add the CMC, we actually show increased heat instability while lowering our tartaric stability, but we're still not tartaric stable. So what's happening here, and here's another example, you start with the tannin level and your protein stable, but both are still unstable later. And then here's another bad one where, again, you start even more stable on the protein stability. You're at 0, but then it goes up to over. And this is because of a protein tannin thermo unstable complex. And it when you have stable proteins combined with tannins, they get together, they become stable. You add CMC on top of that, and that's even more unstable, and that will throw. So how do you get around that? Use the manoprotein product at this point, and use ManoStab instead, because that doesn't get affected by the thermo unstable complex. It will keep that thermo unstable complex stable while also not aggravating it to become unstable. All right, this we'll go over very quickly. I'm going to shoot through this in just a few seconds. Don't clog. CellStab is not a clogging product. However, if you have high clogging turbidities already, you need to take steps to lower that before you filter and before you add CMC CellStab, because that will clog your filter. And also, again, test for coloring matter, because if you have that interaction, that will lead to or aggravate a filtering issue, which will then pull the colloid out. It could also pull the CellStab back out, and you'll have a 1-2 punch of both a heat and cold unstable wine again after filtration. So just always check for turbidities and clogging indexes and color stability. This is so important. Trying to identify the haze. CellStab on rosé wines, just make sure again, color stabilized. Because you need to make sure that it's both color stable so it doesn't, and so that it doesn't clog. So those are the two big ones. Manostab, similar. Make sure it is make sure that it is color stabilized before you use Manostab, and also you don't have to worry about the heat stability. If you want the checklist, email us. We're happy to send that out. All right, and so we looked at this before. Surprise, surprise, no surprise here. Manostab is what was put in to the wines to make sure that they were to improve stability. So Manostab, it can stabilize your color generally, and we're looking more into this. So just make sure you follow the guidelines. That it can handle some color instability, but just make sure you get it down enough in your red wines if you're going to use it on red wine. Calcium tartrates, we're not even going to really look at this except to say that there's still surefire way to stabilize your wines in terms of so the best thing is to make sure calcium is low coming in from your vineyard in the first place. There is some research that shows you can maybe use a race mate, like a calcium race mate, to try to pull it out, but it's not you can't on it. It's not dependable. It's not consistent, and can also lead to clogging of your filter. So just always test for that, or at least get to know your wines well enough over time to know that you don't clog with this. Or if you are clogging, you've tested for everything else, test for this. All right. Just went over that. So final filtration before bottling. Those are your parameters. Check everything. These last two slides are pretty awesome. We have these printed out in our warehouse, so if you want a copy sent to you, we can do that. We'll mail it to you via snail mail. And this is a very comprehensive bottling timeline. So this is for white wines. We also have one for red wines. And just step by step, here's what you do first, here's what you do second, here's what you do. And again, the F's are the filtrations. If you have any questions, and it says polytartral, ignore that. That is not, that's used outside of the US because it's not legal here. So we use CellStab. For red wine, we don't use anything there except for possibly Manostab, and then possibly the new product coming down the line. So we'll let you know when that comes out. Thank you very much. I know that was a lot. Thank you for bearing with me. I know I was going very quickly, so please ask your questions, and I'm going to check those out right now. Here is the, before I do that, here's the contact info at the stores, at the main warehouse and office. And if you missed anything from this webinar, you can email Caitlin. So let me check, see what we've got here for, where am I? Sharing, stop sharing, there we go. All right. So let's see, questions. Can you please email me? Hold on, I'm trying to figure this out. Bear with me. Can you please email the presentation? Yes, we can email you. Big T, see ya. We'll see. Oh, so the recording itself, we don't send the file. We send you a link. So I'll just, if you haven't read that yet, we'll send you a link. It verifies your email with us, and then it decrypts it. It's basically encrypted, and we'll do that. Okay, so we've got some requests here for mailing the white and red wine checklist. Okay, great. Any other questions? It looks like there are no questions, probably because I went so quickly. Let's see. No. So maybe that means I covered everything. I doubt that. Again, thank you for sitting through that. I think that was 91 slides. And again, that's cut down. I do encourage you, if you're ever around one of our in-person seminars that we hold, we do go through the longer version, and we serve coffee and refreshments and snacks with those seminars. We also have bigger seminars called rendezvous. So far right now, they're only on the West Coast, unfortunately, but we're looking to expand them. And those are a half-day seminar covering bigger topics in general, and they can include things like stabilization. So we can go through those more in depth. Schedule a meeting with your rep or a phone meeting, a Skype meeting with us, and we're more than happy to go over any of this with you. Specific questions, problems that you're encountering, interpreting results. The ISTC 50, for example, can be very complicated. It looks a little imposing or a little intimidating, but we'll help you read that. Same with the DIT testing. I thank you very much for your attention and hope to see you again soon. We have more webinars coming up, so keep an eye out in your emails for them, and have a great day and happy bottling out there. Stay safe and enjoy some good wine.